Snoop Dogg disguises himself as a homeless person to test the police. What happens next is crazy. The golden autumn light bathed Central Park as Snoop Dogg, unrecognizable in a tattered coat and mismatched sneakers, sat silently on a weathered bench. His eyes tracked the passing crowd, while a hidden camera inside a paper bag captured every glance, every whisper of judgment. When a police officer approached, tension thickened in the air. "ID," the officer demanded, radiating authority. "Just eating lunch, officer." The confrontation spiraled into a dramatic standoff, drawing a crowd, news crews, and an unforgettable revelation. The truth? This was no ordinary day. It was an experiment to expose prejudice in public spaces. But before we dive deeper into this unbelievable story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you love compelling stories like this, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what's next. The autumn sun painted Central Park in hues of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns where tourists and locals alike sought refuge from Manhattan's relentless pace. Near the Bethesda fountain, where the censure's gilded form caught the late afternoon light, a figure slouched on a weathered bench, seemingly lost in the symphony of urban life that swirled around him. To the casual observer, he was just another of the city's forgotten souls, but nothing could have been further from the truth. Beneath the frayed hood of a formerly black coat now faded to the color of storm clouds, Snoop Dogg's eyes tracked the steady stream of park visitors. His disguise had been meticulously chosen, thrift store cast-offs layered with the kind of careful carelessness that spoke of long-term hardship rather than a temporary setback. The mismatched sneakers, one Nike, one Adidas, both scuffed beyond recognition, had been a particularly inspired touch. He'd spent hours walking through puddles and dragging them across concrete to achieve just the right level of wear. The contrast between his appearance and his surroundings couldn't have been more stark. Young professionals in designer athleisure jogged past, their wireless earbuds worth more than his entire outfit. Children in private school uniforms played near the fountain, watched by nannies who kept a careful distance from his bench. A couple in matching Patagonia jackets steered their path around him, the woman clutching her purse a little tighter as they passed. Snoop reached into the paper bag beside him, movements deliberate and unhurried. Inside, nested among the carefully arranged detritus of street life, a small camera lens caught the light. He adjusted it slightly, ensuring it had a clear view of the area in front of the bench. The device was broadcasting everything to a secure server where a team of producers monitored the feed. Everything was in place. "Time to see how deep this rabbit hole goes," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the splash of the fountain. The words carried none of his signature drawl. He'd been practicing a different cadence, something rearier, worn down by imagined years of hardship. Even if someone recognized his distinctive features, his behavior and voice would make them doubt their own eyes. His mind drifted to the news stories that had sparked this experiment, reports of harassment, of people being pushed out of public spaces simply because they didn't fit someone's idea of who belonged there. He'd read about a retired teacher turned away from a park bench in Seattle, a veteran in Miami arrested for loitering outside the very VA hospital where he had an appointment. Each story had stoked a fire in him, a need to expose the casual cruelty that so many faced daily. Around him, the park pulsed with life. A street musician's saxophone wove through the air, playing Autumn in New York with the kind of soul that only comes from really living the city's rhythms. Children's laughter erupted from the playground, punctuated by the sharp whistle of a nanny calling her charges in for lunch. Pigeons strutted near his feet, hopeful for crumbs from the sandwich he'd been nursing for the past hour. The smells of the city drifted past. Hot dogs from a nearby cart, the earthy dampness rising from the grass, someone's expensive perfume leaving a trail of jasmine in its wake. Each sensation added another layer to the scene, making it feel more real, more lived in. This wasn't just a stage for his experiment. It was a slice of New York life, captured in all its complicated glory. He noticed how people's eyes slid past him, the practiced unseeing that New Yorkers had perfected. Some gazes lingered longer, carrying judgment or pity or confusion about his presence in this carefully maintained corner of the city. Each reaction told its own story, revealed its own prejudices. He made mental notes of it all, building a catalog of human nature in action. The paper bag crinkled as he reached in again, this time pulling out half a sandwich. The action was calculated. Eating was humanizing, made him less of a threat to the nervous passers-by. But it also established his right to be there. He wasn't sleeping or panhandling, he was simply existing in a public space, doing what anyone might do on their lunch break. A group of tourists paused nearby, consulting their phones and a worn paper map. Their cameras swung in every direction, capturing the fountain, the terrace, the carefully framed shots of each other against the backdrop of autumn trees. But they conspicuously avoided including his bench in their photos, as if his presence might somehow taint their perfect New York memories. In the distance, a police cruiser rolled slowly along the park's perimeter. Snoop tracked its progress without seeming to watch, years of performing activities giving him the ability to observe while appearing absorbed in his meal. The car moved with the predatory slowness of a patrol, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they noticed him. That was, after all, the point. He settled deeper into his role, shoulders curling forward slightly, making himself smaller, a unconscious gesture he'd observed in people who'd learned to try to disappear in plain sight. The sandwich provided cover for him to mutter quietly, testing his voice one final time. "I'm just a man eating lunch. Nothing to see here. Nothing at all." But there would be plenty to see. The camera caught it all, the subtle shifts in body language as people passed, the deliberate distances maintained, the unspoken choreography of privilege and prejudice playing out in one of America's most famous public spaces. Soon, he knew, someone would decide he didn't belong here, and when they did, every moment would be captured, every word recorded, every assumption exposed. The stage was set, the actors were in place, though they didn't know they were performing, and Snoop, hidden in plain sight, waited for the show to begin. The police cruiser that had been circling the park finally came to a stop near the Bethesda fountain. Inside, Officer James Martinez drummed his fingers against the steering wheel, his academy ring tapping out an impatient rhythm against the plastic. At 28, he was still new enough to the force that his uniform maintained a crisp, fresh costume cleaner's look, and his badge gleamed as if he polished it daily, which he did. Every morning, that same dedication to perfection had him adjusting his utility belt until each item sat at precisely the right angle, a habit that made his partner roll his eyes. That partner, Officer Thomas Higgins, slouched in the passenger seat, his 23 years on the force evident in every line of his weathered face. His uniform bore the slightly rumpled look of someone who had long ago learned that comfort mattered more than appearance when you were working a 12-hour shift. Where Martinez saw every patrol as an opportunity to prove himself, Higgins saw each day as another chance to make it home without paperwork or incident. "Got another one setting up camp," Martinez said, nodding toward Snoop's bench. His voice carried the clipped tone of someone who'd grown up watching too many police procedurals, trying to sound authoritative. "Third one this week. You'd think they'd learn this isn't their personal living room." Higgins squinted through the windshield, years of experience lending a different perspective to the scene. The figure on the bench wasn't sprawled out or surrounded by belongings, just eating a sandwich, existing in a public space like anyone else. "He's not bothering anyone, Martinez. Let's do another loop. Check the north end of the park." But Martinez was already unbuckling his seatbelt, his jaw set in that familiar way that made Higgins' stomach tighten. "You saw how Mrs. Henderson from the Parks Committee chewed out the captain last week about maintaining standards. You want that happening again?" Higgins recognized the futility of arguing. Martinez, like many young officers, still believed every situation could be solved through assertive action. He hadn't yet learned that some problems were better left alone, that not every person who looked out of place needed to be confronted. With a weary sigh, Higgins pushed his door open and followed his partner. Martinez approached the bench with the straight-backed stride he'd perfected at the academy, each step purposeful and measured. "Afternoon, sir," he called out, his tone carrying that particular edge of authority that often created the very tension it was supposed to prevent. "Mind if we have a word?" Higgins hung back slightly, positioning himself to watch both his partner and the growing number of onlookers who had noticed the police presence. A young mother hurried her children away from the fountain, while a couple on a nearby bench began filming discreetly with their phones. Each observer added another layer of pressure to an already delicate situation. "Just enjoying my lunch, officer," Snoop replied, his voice carrying none of its familiar cadence. Instead, it emerged weathered and quiet, the sound of someone who had learned to make himself small in the face of authority. He held up his half-eaten sandwich as evidence, the movement deliberate and non-threatening. When the boy Martinez shifted his weight, hand resting casually near his utility belt, a gesture that appeared relaxed to civilians but broadcasted tension to anyone familiar with police body language. "We've been getting complaints about people loitering in this area. Going to need to see some ID." Behind him, Higgins winced at the word loitering. There was no city ordinance against sitting on a park bench, no law being broken, and they both knew it. But Martinez had that look in his eyes, the one that said he'd already decided how this interaction would end. It was the same look Higgins had seen too many times before, the one that usually preceded paperwork and civilian complaints. The police cruiser that had been circling the park finally came to a stop near the Bethesda fountain. Inside, Officer James Martinez drummed his fingers against the steering wheel, his academy ring tapping out an impatient rhythm against the plastic. At 28, he was still new enough to the force that his uniform maintained a crisp, fresh from the cleaner's look. And his badge gleamed as if he polished it daily, which he did. Every morning, that same dedication to perfection had him adjusting his utility belt until each item sat at precisely the right angle, a habit that made his partner roll his eyes. That partner, Officer Thomas Higgins, slouched in the passenger seat, his 23 years on the force evident in every line of his weathered face. His uniform bore the slightly rumpled look of someone who had long ago learned that comfort mattered more than appearance when you were working a 12-hour shift. Where Martinez saw every patrol as an opportunity to prove himself, Higgins saw each day as another chance to make it home without paperwork or incident. "Got another one setting up camp," Martinez said, nodding toward Snoop's bench. His voice carried the clipped tone of someone who'd grown up watching too many police procedurals, trying to sound authoritative. "Third one this week. You think they'd learned this isn't their personal living room?" Higgins squinted through the windshield, years of experience lending a different perspective to the scene. The figure on the bench wasn't sprawled out or surrounded by belongings, just eating a sandwich, existing in a public space like anyone else. "He's not bothering anyone, Martinez. Let's do another loop, check the north end of the park." But Martinez was already unbuckling his seatbelt, his jaw set in that familiar way that made Higgins's stomach tighten. "You saw how Mrs. Henderson from the Parks Committee chewed out the captain last week about maintaining standards. You want that happening again?" Higgins recognized the futility of arguing. Martinez, like many young officers, still believed every situation could be solved through assertive action. He hadn't yet learned that some problems were better left alone, that not every person who looked out of place needed to be confronted. With a weary sigh, Higgins pushed his door open and followed his partner. Martinez approached the bench with the straight-backed stride he'd perfected at the academy, each step purposeful and measured. "Afternoon, sir," he called out, his tone carrying that particular edge of authority that often created the very tension it was supposed to prevent. "Mind if we have a word?" Higgins hung back slightly, positioning himself to watch both his partner and the growing number of onlookers who had noticed the police presence. A young mother hurried her children away from the fountain, while a couple on a nearby bench began filming discreetly with their phones. Each observer added another layer of pressure to an already delicate situation. "Just enjoying my lunch, officer," Snoop replied, his voice carrying none of its familiar cadence. Instead, it emerged weathered and quiet, the sound of someone who had learned to make himself small in the face of authority. He held up his half-eaten sandwich as evidence, the movement deliberate and non-threatening. Martinez shifted his weight, hand resting casually near his utility belt, a gesture that appeared relaxed to civilians but broadcasted tension to anyone familiar with police body language. "We've been getting complaints about people loitering in this area. Going to need to see some ID." Behind him, Higgins winced at the word loitering. There was no city ordinance against sitting on a park bench, no law being broken, and they both knew it. But Martinez had that look in his eyes, the one that said he'd already decided how this interaction would end. It was the same look Higgins had seen too many times before, the one that usually preceded paperwork and civilian complaints. When Snoop took his time answering, deliberately finishing his bite of sandwich before reaching for his pocket, Martinez's posture stiffened. The casual rest of his hand on his utility belt became more pronounced, his fingers drumming against the hard plastic. "Today, sir," he added, that last word carrying a hint of sarcasm that made Higgins wince. "Don't see how my ID matters if I'm just sitting here," Snoop replied mildly, though there was steel beneath the weathered tone. "Public park, public bench, unless that changed recently." His eyes, sharp despite his slouched posture, noted every subtle shift in Martinez's stance, every tightening of jaw muscles. Martinez took a half step closer, using his height to cast a shadow over the bench. "Actually, sir, I can ask for ID whenever I have reasonable suspicion of unlawful activity. Now, are we going to do this the easy way, or should I grip that six-finger hand of yours and thus get all pissed off because I didn't?" "James," Higgins murmured, his voice pitched low enough that only his partner could hear. "Take a breath." He's not doing anything wrong, but he could see his words weren't reaching Martinez, whose face had taken on that particular flush that meant he felt his authority was being challenged. Around them, the park's atmosphere had shifted subtly but noticeably. A jogger paused mid-stretch, her earbuds dangling as she watched the scene unfold. A tourist family that had been posing for pictures now stood awkwardly, with their selfie stick forgotten in hand, their vacation photos forgotten in favor of the real-life drama playing out before them. Two business-suited men on their lunch break had stopped their conversation, phones held casually at angles that suggested they were recording. An older woman walking her poodle made a show of crossing to the other side of the path, her expression torn between concern and curiosity. Near the fountain, a street performer had paused his saxophone solo, the absence of music making the tension in the air feel even thicker. Each observer added another layer of pressure to the situation, their collective attention like a spotlight on the unfolding scene. Snoop carefully folded the sandwich wrapper, each crease deliberate and unhurried. The methodical movement drew every eye, creating a pocket of silence in the busy park. He understood the power of timing, how a calculated pause could unsettle those used to immediate compliance. The paper crinkled softly as he smoothed it flat, the sound almost loud in the tense atmosphere. "Officer," he began, his voice carrying the weight of dignity rather than confrontation. "I've been sitting here watching people all afternoon. Saw a group of college kids sprawled out on the grass over there. Nobody asked them for ID. Saw businessmen on their phones, mothers with their kids, tourists taking pictures. Nobody questioned their right to be here." Each observation landed like a gentle rebuke, highlighting the discriminatory nature of the officer's demand, without directly challenging his authority. His eyes, sharp beneath the weathered exterior, caught Martinez's slight flinch at the implied criticism. He kept his body language deliberately non-threatening, shoulders relaxed, hands visible and moving slowly. Every gesture was choreographed to present the image of reasonable compliance, while subtly forcing Martinez to confront his own biases. "You see that young lady on the bench across the way?" Snoop continued, nodding toward a woman in designer activewear who was openly filming the interaction. "Been there longer than me. Funny how her loitering doesn't seem to bother anyone." The word loitering carried just enough emphasis to highlight its absurdity without tipping into sarcasm. Martinez's face flushed deeper, the color creeping up his neck as his hand tightened on his belt. Each of Snoop's measured observations stripped away another layer of his professional facade, revealing the personal frustration beneath. "Sir, I'm not going to ask again," he snapped, his voice carrying that dangerous edge that suggested control slipping away. "Your ID, now." The demand hung in the air, made more conspicuous by Snoop's unhurried response. He reached into his pocket with exaggerated slowness, watching Martinez's fingers twitch near his weapon. "Careful now, officer," he murmured, just loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. "Wouldn't want anyone thinking you feel threatened by a man eating his lunch." Martinez took another step forward, invading the space around the bench. His academy training warred with his rising anger, creating a visible tension in his movements. "You think this is funny? You think making a scene is going to help your situation?" His voice had taken on that particular tone that veteran officers recognized, the sound of authority being challenged and reacting poorly. Each word revealed more of his inexperience, his need to dominate the situation becoming increasingly apparent to the onlookers. The phones recording the scene captured every shift in his stance, every crack in his professional demeanor. His eyes darted between Snoop and the growing crowd, aware that he was losing control of the narrative, but unable to step back without feeling like he'd lost face. Behind him, Higgins shifted his weight uneasily, decades of experience screaming at him to intervene. He recognized the dangerous trajectory of the confrontation, had seen similar situations escalate from simple questioning to unnecessary arrests. His instinct was to pull his partner back, to find a way to de-escalate before things went too far. But stepping in now would undermine Martinez's authority in front of the crowd, potentially damaging their working relationship. More importantly, it might trigger exactly the kind of defensive reaction he was trying to prevent. Higgins had spent years learning when to step in and when to let things play out, but this situation balanced on a knife's edge. He watched as Martinez's hand drifted closer to his weapon, a subtle movement that sent ripples of tension through the watching crowd. The choice pressed down on him with increasing urgency: maintain the partner loyalty that police work demanded, or prevent what he could see developing into a serious incident. Every second of hesitation felt like a silent endorsement of Martinez's approach, adding another weight to the burden of his conscience. The tension in the air finally snapped when a woman in running gear stepped away from the growing crowd, her ponytail swinging with the decisiveness of her movement. Sarah Chen had already completed 5 miles of her usual route when she'd noticed the confrontation, and the familiar sight of law enforcement singling out someone who didn't fit their idea of belonging had stopped her in her tracks. As a civil rights attorney, she'd seen this scene play out too many times in courtrooms and depositions. "Excuse me, officers," she called out, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone used to speaking in courtrooms. "I've been watching this man for the past 20 minutes while I stretched. He's done nothing but sit quietly and eat his lunch." She positioned herself deliberately in the sightline of several recording phones, knowing from experience how important documentation could be. Sweat still gleamed on her face from her run, but her stance was professional, grounded. "Would you mind explaining the legal basis for demanding his identification? Because from where I'm standing, this looks like a clear case of discriminatory enforcement of park rules, if such rules even exist." Martinez's head snapped toward her, his expression darkening at this new challenge to his authority. "Ma'am, this is a police matter. I'm going to have to ask you to step back and let us do our job." His voice carried that particular edge of condescension, often reserved for civilians who dared to question police procedures. But Sarah stood her ground, years of courthouse confrontations evident in her steady gaze. "Your job, Officer Martinez," she made a point of reading his nameplate, "is to protect and serve all members of the public, not to harass people for existing in public spaces. I'd be happy to cite relevant cases about discriminatory enforcement of loitering law." The officer took 2 quick steps toward her, his previous focus on Snoop momentarily forgotten in his anger at this new challenge. "You're interfering with the police investigation," he snapped, voice rising enough to draw even more attention from passers-by. "One more word and you'll be facing charges yourself." His reaction sent ripples through the watching crowd. A middle-aged man in a business suit pulled out his phone and ostentatiously began dialing, speaking just loud enough to be heard. "Yes? I'd like to speak to someone about filing a formal complaint about officer conduct." Near the fountain, a group of students had their phones raised, the scene reflected in dozens of small screens that would soon multiply across social media. The crowd had grown beyond casual onlookers now. A street vendor wheeled his hot dog cart closer, positioning himself for a better view while pretending to rearrange his condiments. 2 women who had been playing chess at a nearby table abandoned their game, their whispered commentary adding to the mounting pressure of public scrutiny. Even the pigeons seemed to sense the tension, clustering at the edges of the gathering as if waiting to see what would unfold. Each new observer added another layer of witness to the scene, their collective presence forming a silent jury. Some pulled out phones to record, others exchanged knowing looks or shook their heads in disapproval. The weight of their attention pressed down on the situation like a physical force, transforming a simple confrontation into a public referendum on police conduct. Martinez spun back toward Snoop, his movements sharp with barely contained rage. The crowd's scrutiny and the lawyer's intervention had stripped away his professional veneer, revealing the raw nerve of insecurity beneath. His hand no longer merely rested on his utility belt but gripped it, knuckles white against the black leather. Each breath came faster than the last, causing his chest to heave against his Kevlar vest. "Last chance," he barked, voice pitched to carry across the growing crowd. "Either show some ID or you're coming with me for obstruction." The threat hung in the air like summer lightning, crackling with potential violence. His boots scraped against the pavement as he widened his stance, unconsciously settling into a pre-confrontational posture that academy training had drilled into muscle memory. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool autumn air, and a muscle twitched rhythmically in his jaw. His eyes darted between Snoop, the crowd, and the recording phones, each glance feeding his growing sense of being trapped in a situation spiraling beyond his control. When Snoop shifted slightly on the bench, Martinez's hand twitched toward his weapon. A moment that sent a ripple of murmurs through the watching crowd. "You think having an audience makes you untouchable?" Martinez's voice had taken on a dangerous edge, the words coming through clenched teeth. "Think again. I can add inciting a riot to the charges if these people don't back off." His free hand gestured sharply at the gathering crowd, the movement aggressive enough to make several onlookers step back. Higgins finally broke his paralysis, stepping forward to place a steadying hand on his partner's shoulder. "James," he said quietly, using his partner's first name deliberately to pierce through the fog of anger. "Take a breath. Think about how this looks." His voice carried the weight of decades of experience, each word measured to deflate rather than challenge. "The cameras are rolling," Higgins continued, pitching his voice low enough that only Martinez could hear. "Every second of this is being uploaded somewhere. You really want to explain this to internal affairs?" He kept his grip firm on Martinez's shoulder, trying to ground his partner in reality. "Whatever is happening here, it's not worth ending your career over." His eyes met those of several veteran officers who had arrived as backup, and now stood at the periphery of the scene. Their expressions reflected his own concern. They'd all seen promising careers derailed by moments like this, when pride and anger overwhelmed judgment. One of them subtly shook his head, a gesture that spoke volumes about the situation's deterioration. Through it all, Snoop maintained an air of unruffled calm that seemed to infuriate Martinez even more. He tried not to evolve his own inner thought process. At the base of each movement, from smoothing his tattered coat to adjusting his position on the bench, served as a masterclass in passive resistance. His eyes, sharp and alert, despite his weathered appearance, never left Martinez's face. "Officer," Snoop spoke, his voice carrying just enough volume to be caught by the recording phones without seeming confrontational. "Seems to me we both know I'm not breaking any laws. The question is, what happens next?" The words were neutral, but their impact was precisely calculated, forcing Martinez to confront the corner he'd backed himself into. Snoop's apparent tranquility served as a mirror, reflecting and magnifying Martinez's increasing agitation. Even his posture spoke volumes, neither submissive nor aggressive, but rather carrying the quiet dignity of someone who knew exactly what game was being played and had already won. Each calm response added another layer to Martinez's frustration, like water wearing away at a dam. 3 weeks earlier, Snoop sat in his home studio, surrounded by scattered newspapers and open tabs on his laptop. The blue light from the screen illuminated his face as he scrolled through another story about police harassment in public spaces. This time it was a retired school teacher in Seattle, forced off a park bench despite having lived in the neighborhood for 40 years. The week before, it had been a veteran in Miami, arrested outside a VA hospital while waiting for his appointment. Each article stirred memories of his own experiences before fame. The suspicious glances, the unwarranted stops, the constant pressure to justify his presence in nice neighborhoods. Success hadn't entirely shielded him from these encounters. It had just changed their nature. Now security guards who didn't recognize him followed him through high-end stores, their embarrassed apologies afterwards somehow making it worse. The comments section under each article told its own story. People questioning the victims' accounts, suggesting they must have done something to deserve the attention. Others sharing similar experiences, their stories forming a tapestry of systematic bias that stretched across cities and years. Snoop's fingers drummed against his desk as he read, a rhythm building in his mind alongside an idea. He thought about his platform, his influence, and the unique position he occupied in American culture. His phone buzzed with another news alert, this time about a black teenager arrested for loitering outside his own suburban home. Something crystallized in that moment, a plan taking shape that would turn the tables on these assumptions. The following days became a blur of preparation. He worked with a makeup artist who specialized in theatrical aging, learning to apply subtle changes that would alter his appearance without creating a mask that might slip. They experimented with different combinations until they found the right balance, enough to make him unrecognizable while still allowing his natural features to show through. The wardrobe required equal attention to detail. Each piece was carefully selected from thrift stores across the city, then artificially aged to create a convincing history. He spent hours practicing different ways of wearing the clothes, learning how they should hang on his frame, how they would move when he sat or stood. Even the mismatched sneakers were carefully chosen and distressed to tell a specific story. The technical aspects came next. His team worked with documentary filmmakers to develop a hidden camera system that would capture everything without being obvious. They ran tests after test, adjusting angles and lighting, ensuring every interaction would be recorded clearly. The paper bag setup was a particular triumph, appearing completely innocuous while housing state-of-the-art recording equipment. Through it all, Snoop remained focused on the larger purpose behind the deception. This wasn't about creating viral content or generating publicity. It was about holding up a mirror to society, forcing people to confront their own biases in real time. The experiment would only work if it felt authentic, if it captured the genuine reactions of people confronted with their own prejudices. He understood the risks, both personal and professional. Critics would accuse him of creating conflict for attention, of antagonizing law enforcement for views. But the stories kept coming, week after week, of people being pushed out of public spaces simply because someone decided they didn't belong. Someone needed to challenge this pattern, to document it in a way that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Martinez unclipped his radio with trembling fingers, his movements sharp and aggressive as he keyed the mic. The plastic creaked under his grip as he spoke, each word clipped and precise, despite his rising anger. "Dispatch, this is Officer Martinez at Bethesda Fountain. Need a records check and additional units for a suspicious person refusing to identify." His official terminology doing little to mask the personal frustration beneath. Static crackled for a moment before dispatch responded, their professionally neutral tone a stark contrast to Martinez's tension. He spelled out the details from Snoop's provided ID, his jaw clenching tighter with each letter. The park had grown unusually quiet, dozens of onlookers straining to hear the exchange. Even the fountain's constant splash seemed muted, as if the park itself held its breath. "Copy that, Officer Martinez," dispatch replied after a moment. "No matches found in the system. Could be an error, or—" They left the implication hanging, but Martinez seized on it immediately. "Suspected false identification," he barked into the radio, requesting backup for a potential arrest situation. His free hand had returned to his utility belt, fingers drumming against the handcuffs in an unconscious tell of his intentions. Higgins watched this escalation with a growing sense of dread, years of experience screaming warnings in his mind. He'd seen this pattern before, young officers backing themselves into corners, turning minor interactions into career-defining mistakes. His stomach churned as he recognized all the warning signs. The aggressive stance, the trembling hands, the desperate need to assert control over a situation that had already slipped away. Every instinct urged him to step in, to pull rank and experience on his younger partner. But intervention now could make things worse, triggering the exact defensive reaction he hoped to prevent. Martinez was like a wounded animal, cornered by his own pride and the watching crowd. One wrong move could turn this already volatile situation explosive. 23 years on the force had taught Higgins the weight of public perception, how quickly a routine interaction could become tomorrow's headline. He could already imagine the viral videos, the departmental review, the inevitable questions about why a senior officer hadn't prevented this escalation. The knowledge sat heavy in his chest, a familiar burden made heavier by his own action. The crowd had swollen beyond anything Higgins had seen for a routine stop. Tourists had abandoned their photos of the fountain, their cameras now trained on the unfolding drama. Local joggers formed a loose ring around the scene, phones raised like a forest of electronic eyes. Even the hot dog vendors had abandoned their carts to watch, the smell of grilling onions wafting incongruously through the tense atmosphere. Each new arrival added another layer of pressure to the situation. Whispered comments rippled through the gathering, snippets of legal knowledge, comparisons to other incidents, speculation about outcomes. Some onlookers spoke loudly enough to be heard, their commentaries serving as a Greek chorus to the unfolding drama. "Another power trip cop," someone muttered. "Here we go again," sighed another. Through it all, Snoop maintained the same calm demeanor that had characterized his responses from the beginning. His weathered facade never slipped, each movement carefully calculated to appear natural while ensuring optimal camera angles. The hidden lens captured everything: Martinez's escalating aggression, Higgins' conflicted stance, the growing crowd of witnesses. His apparent serenity seemed to exist in its own bubble, undisturbed by the mounting tension around him. When he shifted position on the bench, the movement was unhurried, almost lazy. His eyes, though alert, maintained their weary expression, never betraying the satisfaction of knowing each moment was being preserved for later revelation. The already tense atmosphere shifted as four teenagers sauntered into the scene, their private school uniforms and casual confidence marking them as locals who considered the park their personal playground. They moved with the particular swagger of youth who had never known consequences, trading loud jokes and shoving each other playfully as they approached the gathering crowd. The tallest boy, his blazer deliberately wrinkled in that expensive way that suggested careful cultivation of careless appearance, noticed Snoop first. His smile carried the casual cruelty of adolescence as he nudged his friends. "Check it out," he snickered, voice pitched to Carrie. "Looks like someone lost their way to the shelter." His companions snickered, smartphones already raised to capture what they assumed would be social media gold. "I can't see you ringing up." "Hey, old-timer," another boy called out. His tie loosened just enough to suggest rebellion while staying safely within school dress code. "The donation center's actually on 82nd Street. This is kind of a nice area, you know." The words dripped with the special kind of entitlement that came from never having faced real hardship, each syllable revealing more about the speakers than he realized. A girl in the group, her plaid skirt rolled up against school regulations, pulled out her phone and made a show of dialing. "Should I call the shelter and let them know one of their residents escaped?" Her laugh carried across the increasingly uncomfortable crowd, the sound jarring against the tension that had built around the police confrontation. Martinez watched this new development with an unsettling blend of satisfaction and indifference. His eyes never left Snoop, but the corner of his mouth twitched upward slightly at each teenage barb. Here was the validation he'd been seeking, proof that others shared his belief that some people simply didn't belong in certain spaces. His silence in the face of their taunts spoke volumes about his own biases. The officer's stance remained rigid, his hand still resting on his utility belt, but he made no move to discourage the teenager's behavior. Each moment of inaction reinforced his selective application of authority, highlighting exactly the kind of systemic bias that Snoop's experiment aimed to expose. "Keep moving." Snoop's voice cut through the teenager's laughter like a steel blade wrapped in velvet. Though barely raised above conversational volume, it carried an unmistakable note of authority that stopped the young people in their tracks. "This isn't a game you want to play." His eyes, when they finally met the teenager's startled gazes, held decades of hard-earned wisdom and self-assurance that made their attempted mockery feel suddenly childish and small. With the teenager's retreat still rippling through the crowd, Snoop reached for the paper bag beside him, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The hidden camera inside captured every moment in crystal clarity, its lens positioned perfectly through a carefully crafted tear in the brown paper. As he adjusted the bag's position, ostensibly to protect his half-eaten lunch, the camera's view widened to encompass both Martinez's aggressive stance and the growing crowd of onlookers. The technology concealed within that humble paper bag represented the culmination of weeks of preparation. A compact 4K camera system, borrowed from a documentary filmmaker friend, transmitted a live feed to a secure server where producers monitored every second. The audio pickup, sensitive enough to catch whispered conversations, recorded each of Martinez's escalating threats with perfect clarity. Even the bag itself had been carefully engineered, reinforced in key places to protect the equipment while maintaining its appearance of casual disposal. Snoop allowed himself a moment of satisfaction as he smoothed a wrinkle in the bag's surface, knowing that every gesture added to the growing archive of evidence. The camera caught Martinez's hand tightening on his weapon, recorded the sweat beading on his forehead, documented every micro-expression that revealed the officer's mounting frustration. Each moment strengthened the narrative that would soon explode across social media and news channels. Something about Snoop's careful manipulation of the bag caught Martinez's attention. The officer's eyes narrowed as he watched those deliberate movements, his police instincts finally registering that something about this situation felt orchestrated. The calm defiance, the careful positioning, the way his suspect seemed to be performing for an unseen audience, it all added up to something just beyond his grasp. Martinez took a half step forward, his boot scuffing against the pavement. "What's really in the bag?" he demanded, voice tight with suspicion. His eyes darted between Snoop's face and the paper bag, searching for clues to explain the growing certainty that he was missing something crucial. The comfortable narrative of a simple vagrant refusing to comply had developed unexpected layers that left him increasingly unsure of his footing. The crowd's presence, the lawyer's intervention, and now this strange sense of orchestration, it all combined to set off warning bells in Martinez's mind. His academy training kicked in, urging him to reassess the situation, but pride and momentum kept him locked in his aggressive stance. Every instinct told him he was being played, yet he couldn't see the game. Beneath his weathered disguise, Snoop felt the familiar thrill of performing for an audience, though this time the performance required perfect stillness rather than movement. Each minute that passed added weight to the footage being captured, building a compelling story of power, prejudice, and resistance. His internal satisfaction remained carefully hidden behind the mask of weary resignation he'd crafted for this role. Years of reading crowds from stage had taught him the perfect moment to shift energy, to transform an audience's expectations. He could feel that moment approaching now, building like the tension before a beat drops. Every person gathered around the bench had become part of his performance, though only he knew the full scope of the story being told. The hidden camera continued its silent documentation, capturing every nuance of the unfolding scene. Each second of footage would serve its purpose, not just in exposing one officer's prejudice, but in illuminating the larger patterns of bias that played out daily in public spaces across the country. Snoop's quiet confidence stemmed from knowing he had already succeeded, regardless of how the next few minutes unfolded. The arrival of Channel 7's news van transformed the gathering from a crowd into an audience. Rebecca Chen, the station's lead field reporter, emerged with the practiced efficiency of someone who had covered countless breaking stories. Her crew moved with choreographed precision, setting up portable lights and adjusting camera equipment, even as she assessed the scene with a veteran's eye for narrative. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park, creating perfect lighting for the unfolding drama. Social media had already done its work. Tweets and live streams had drawn the attention of every news desk in the city. Within minutes, 2 more station vans pulled up to the park's perimeter, their satellite dishes stretching skyward like mechanical flowers seeking the sun. Reporters in blazers and comfortable shoes hurried toward the scene, microphones extended like divining rods seeking controversy. "This is Rebecca Chen reporting live from Central Park," she began, her voice carrying that particular tone that made casual observers stop and pay attention. "We're at the Bethesda Fountain, where what appears to be a routine police stop has drawn significant public attention." Behind her, the camera operator smoothly panned across the scene, capturing the tension between Martinez, Higgins, and their seemingly homeless subject. Martinez's composure cracked visibly under the professional camera lights. Sweat darkened the collar of his uniform as he shifted his weight from foot to foot, suddenly aware that every gesture, every expression was being broadcast across the city. The hand that had been so quick to rest on his weapon now hung awkwardly at his side, caught between instinct and awareness of how it might appear on camera. His eyes darted between the news crews and his superior officers arriving at the scene's periphery. Each camera lens felt like an accusation, every microphone a potential threat. The confident authority he'd projected earlier withered under the harsh scrutiny of professional media attention. His jaw worked silently, as if practicing explanations that grew less convincing with each passing moment. "Sir," Rebecca addressed Snoop directly, her microphone extended respectfully, "could you tell us what led to this situation?" The question cut through the ambient noise of the crowd, creating a pocket of anticipatory silence. Other reporters pressed closer, their own microphones forming a metallic bouquet before him. Snoop adjusted his position on the bench with deliberate calm, his movements unhurried despite the forest of cameras now trained on him. "Just came to enjoy the park," he replied, his manufactured voice carrying just the right note of dignified weariness. "Seems some folks have different ideas about who belongs here." The statement hung in the air, perfect in its simplicity, forcing each listener to confront their own assumptions about public spaces and belonging. The moment had arrived, Snoop reached into his tattered coat, the movement deliberate enough to keep Martinez from reacting too quickly, and pulled out a smartphone. The device's sleek modernity contrasted sharply with his carefully crafted appearance of poverty. With practiced timing, he tapped the screens several times, and suddenly, the fountains surrounding screens, phones, cameras, and tablets lit up with incoming notifications. "Let me show you something, Officer Martinez," Snoop said, his voice shifting subtly, the manufactured weariness falling away like a shed coat. The familiar drawl began to creep back into his words as he held up the phone, displaying a live feed of their confrontation from multiple angles. "For the past 3 hours, we've been conducting a social experiment about prejudice and power in public spaces." He stood slowly, his posture straightening, years of staged presence replacing the carefully practiced stoop. The transformation was remarkable, like watching a master actor step out of character in mid-performance. As he spoke, his hands moved to the edges of his hood, pushing it back to reveal his discriminative features. "I'm Snoop Dogg, and this entire interaction has been documented for a project on discriminatory enforcement of public space regulations." The revelation rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Recognition dawned in waves, first from the teenagers who had taunted him earlier, their faces draining of color as they realized their role in the demonstration, then spreading outward through the gathered spectators, phones raised higher, social media notifications chiming in a cascade of digital awareness as the story broke in real time. Martinez's reaction transformed his face into a museum of conflicting emotions. The blood drained from his features so quickly that he swayed slightly, one hand reaching blindly for support that wasn't there. His mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish suddenly finding itself on dry land. The authority he'd wielded so confidently moments before evaporated in the face of instant, overwhelming public exposure. "This is a setup," he finally managed to croak, his voice cracking on the last word. "You can't do this. It's entrapment." His hand moved instinctively toward his utility belt again, but froze halfway as he remembered the cameras. Sweat had soaked through his uniform shirt, dark patches spreading under his arms and across his chest. His eyes darted frantically between Snoop, the cameras, and the growing crowd, searching for an escape route from a situation that had become inescapable. The crowd's response built like a wave approaching the shore. It started with gasps of recognition, followed by scattered applause that quickly grew in volume. Phones emerged even faster now, everyone desperate to capture the moment of revelation. The teenagers who had mocked him earlier tried to slip away, but found themselves caught in the press of people, forced to witness the consequences of their earlier cruelty. "Oh my God," someone in the crowd exclaimed. "This is brilliant." The comment sparked a cascade of reactions, cheers, scattered applause, and excited conversations as people realized they had witnessed something historic. The news reporters pressed closer, their questions overlapping in an eager chorus. Some members of the crowd began sharing their own stories of discrimination, their voices carrying renewed confidence in the face of this public vindication. Through it all, Snoop maintained his now commanding presence, each movement deliberate and purposeful. The transformation from seemingly vulnerable homeless man to cultural icon served as its own powerful statement about appearances and assumptions. His revealed identity cast every previous interaction in a new light, forcing everyone present to confront their own roles in the social dynamics that had played out before them. Captain Jane Monroe's arrival carried the weight of 27 years of command presence. She emerged from her unmarked car with the measured grace of someone who understood that leadership sometimes required theatrical timing. Her pressed uniform and ramrod-straight posture provided a stark contrast to Martinez's now disheveled appearance. The crowd parted instinctively before her as she approached the scene, her dark eyes taking in every detail with the precision of a battlefield commander assessing casualties. 2 internal affairs officers flanked her, their civilian suits marking them as distinct from the uniformed officers gathering at the perimeter. Monroe had called them the moment the first social media alerts hit her phone. In situations like this, speed and decisiveness often meant the difference between containment and catastrophe. The setting sun cast long shadows across the park, but the news crew's lights illuminated the scene like a stage. "Officer Martinez!" she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of command that made everyone stand a little straighter. "Step away from the civilian and surrender your weapon and badge to Lieutenant Rogers." Her words cut through the murmuring crowd like a knife through warm butter. She had handled similar situations before, though perhaps none quite this public, and understood the importance of immediate, visible action. Monroe turned to the gathered media, her expression professional but approachable. "The department takes allegations of discriminatory enforcement extremely seriously. Officer Martinez will be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation of this incident." Each word was chosen with the careful precision of someone who understood that tomorrow's headlines were being written in real time. Life. Martinez's face flushed deep red as the reality of his situation finally hit home. "Captain, this is completely unfair," he protested, his voice cracking with desperate indignation. "He orchestrated this whole thing. He was trying to provoke a response." His hands gestured wildly at Snoop, who remained calm and composed on his bench. "This is entrapment. He's the one who should be arrested." The excuses tumbled out faster now, each one weaker than the last. "I was just following procedure. Maintaining order in the park. Responding to complaints about loitering." His words carried the hollow ring of rehearsed justifications meeting harsh reality. Several of his fellow officers winced at the mounting desperation in his voice, recognizing the sound of a career imploding in real time. "There were complaints from the Parks Committee," Martinez continued, grasping at straws. "Mrs. Henderson said we needed to be more proactive about... He trailed off as Monroe's steady gaze bore into him, the weight of her silence more damning than any verbal response could have been. The crowd watched in tense silence as the last vestiges of his authority crumbled beneath the combined pressure of public exposure and official censure. As Captain Monroe finished addressing the media, Snoop rose from the bench that had served as his stage for the past 3 hours. The transformation in his bearing was complete now. No trace remained of the weathered stranger who had sparked this confrontation. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of both his celebrity and his lived experience, each word measured and purposeful. "What happened here today isn't about one officer or one incident," he began, his familiar cadence drawing the crowd into closer attention. "This is about a pattern that plays out every day in parks, on streets, and in public spaces across America. People being pushed out, questioned, and criminalized just for existing in places where others think they don't belong." He gestured to the park around them, the manicured lawns and pristine paths that supposedly belonged to everyone but were often policed, for some more than others. "Officer Martinez isn't unique," Snoop continued, his tone carrying neither anger nor triumph, but rather a deep weariness born of long observation. "He's just the one who got caught on camera today. The real problem isn't individual officers. It's a system that teaches people to see threat and suspicion in certain faces, certain clothes, certain ways of existing in public space." The hidden camera in the paper bag continued recording, capturing every word of this final act in the social experiment he had orchestrated. His gaze swept across the gathered crowd, meeting the eyes of the teenagers who had mocked him earlier, the jogger who had intervened, the officers who had arrived as backup. Change doesn't start with policies or procedures. It starts with recognizing our own biases, acknowledging how we participate in systems of exclusion. Today wasn't about embarrassing one officer. It was about holding up a mirror to society and asking, who do we think belongs here? Who gets to feel safe in public spaces? And who has to justify their very presence? As the crowd began to disperse and the news crews packed up their equipment, Snoop returned to the bench that had served as the centerpiece of his social experiment. The evening light painted long shadows across the park, and a gentle breeze stirred the fallen leaves around his feet. He pulled out a crisp envelope from inside his coat, no longer the weathered garment of a homeless man, but still carrying the weight of the afternoon's events in its fibers. The note he placed beneath the bench was handwritten, his distinctive script flowing across the cream-colored paper. To the next person who sits here. This bench belongs to you. It belongs to everyone who seeks rest, reflection, or simply a moment of peace in this public space. Your presence here is valid. Your existence here is justified. Your story matters. He weighted the envelope with a small stone, positioning it where future visitors would discover it like a message in a bottle, washed up on the shores of their daily lives. Beneath these words, he added a second message. If anyone questions your right to be here, remember that public spaces are for the public, all of the public. The only privilege required is being human. The simplicity of the statement belied its power. Much like the simple act of sitting on a bench, had revealed complex layers of social prejudice and institutional bias. The park had quieted now, returning to its usual evening rhythm. The fountain's steady splash provided a soundtrack for Snoop's final moments in this space that had transformed from a stage for his experiment into something more meaningful, a symbol of the ongoing struggle for equality in public spaces. He stood for a moment, observing how the changing light played across the water, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. His mind wandered back to the articles that had inspired this project, countless stories of people being pushed out of public spaces, their mere presence deemed suspicious or unwelcome. He thought about the teenagers who had mocked him, now forced to confront their own prejudices, about Martinez, whose career would become a case study in unconscious bias and abuse of authority, about Higgins, whose silence in the face of injustice represented its own form of complicity. The hidden camera footage would be edited into a documentary, he knew, reaching millions through social media and streaming platforms, but the real impact would be measured in smaller moments, in conversations around dinner tables, in training sessions at police academies, in the subtle shifts of public consciousness that occur when people are forced to confront their own biases. As he walked toward the waiting SUV, Snoop reflected on how a simple bench had become both witness and catalyst to a larger conversation about belonging and justice. The experiment had succeeded beyond his expectations, not just in exposing individual prejudice, but in creating a moment of collective reflection about who gets to occupy public spaces and why. Long after Snoop's SUV had disappeared from view, people lingered around the bench, drawn to the spot as if it had been transformed into a kind of informal monument. Sarah Chen, the jogger who had first spoken up, found herself in conversation with an elderly man who had watched the entire scene unfold. "You know," she said, running her fingers along the bench's weathered wood, "I've handled discrimination cases before, but seeing it play out like this, in real time, it hits differently." The teenagers who had earlier mocked Snoop remained at the periphery of the crowd, their previous bravado replaced by visible discomfort. One of them, the boy who had made the shelter comment, approached the bench slowly. He stood there for a long moment, then pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. "Posting about what happened?" his friend asked. "No," he replied quietly. "Need talk about some things." A young mother who had been watching with her children took their hands and led them to the bench, sitting down deliberately where Snoop had been. "This is important," she told them, her voice carrying to those nearby. "I want you to understand what happened here today." She began explaining about prejudice and privilege in terms her children could grasp, turning the moment into a teaching opportunity that would likely stay with them far longer than any classroom lesson. The gathered people began sharing their own stories, tales of being questioned in upscale shops, of security guards following them through museums, of neighbors calling police on family barbecues. The bench had become a confessional of sorts, each story adding another layer to the deeper truth that Snoop's experiment had exposed. Even those who had initially watched with skepticism found themselves drawn into these conversations, their perspectives slowly shifting through the power of shared experiences.